Hi, I'm Mike Reynolds, a senior reporter covering the media industry with S&P Global Market Intelligence, Tech, Media, and Telecom News Team. Welcome to MediaTalk, a podcast hosted by S&P Global, wherein the news and research staff explore issues in the ever-evolving media landscape. Today, I'm joined by Stefan Modrich, my colleague on the TMT News Team. Stefan covers tech policy. With Congress back in session this week after its summer hiatus, Stefan is going to weigh in on what's on the Washington, D.C. watch relative to a number of topics, including cybersecurity, AI, and M&A as the 2024 session starts to wind down. How you doing today, Stefan?
Mike, I'm doing well. It's good to be back in DC. I have to say, the White Sox maybe needing to give me a September call up here. It's been a pretty brutal stretch, but other than that, it's been a good summer, and I'm looking forward to our chat today.
Stefan spent time back in Chicago, and he's going to regale us a little bit about his 4-night stay there when he was visiting the United Center for the Democratic National Convention. Stefan, this is your first time covering an event like this, right? What were your thoughts going in?
Yeah, it was for sure a unique experience. I think definitely what stood out to me from the across the 4 days was an emphasis throughout the entire event, from the actual official primetime events that you all in the audience may have watched at home, to some of the more lower profile behind the scenes events that took place during the day. Was a lot of tech adjacent topics, and just underscores a lot of the themes of our coverage here in terms of the way that artificial intelligence and some of the enterprise tech that affects different industries is also becoming increasingly used in the political realm.
Anything or anybody that surprised you inside the United Center?
Yes, I didn't actually get the chance to talk to him in person, but I did see Mark Hamill for about a split second. And the podcast celebrity Charlemagne the God was there. Those were a couple of off the beaten track experiences that you don't see every day on the TMT beat, on the policy beat at least. Those were definitely a couple of highlights from my end.
I think you had an interview with Zoe Lrin, the Democratic Congresswoman from California's 18th district, which I guess covers San Jose and part of Silicon Valley. You guys talked a lot about AI.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Mike. Yeah, Lofgren is the ranking member of the House Science, Space, and Technology Committee, and also a member of the newly appointed House AI Task Force. So she, like many lawmakers and governors and who's who of Democratic surrogates for the Harris-Walz campaign, were on the Media Row in this sort of atrium area where the Michael Jordan statue is housed now, right outside the stadium itself. And so we discussed the European Union's new AI Act. And so my question to her essentially was how Congress should craft legislation that would lead to some of these regulatory frameworks for AI that we've been talking about. And her response was she thinks the EU is doing some things that are not necessarily very, very smart in her view. She does feel that there should be some regulation of AI, but she wants to be carefully crafted against some specific risks and also formulated in a way that supports innovation. She also told me that she met with some EU regulators a couple of months ago, and she's concerned about their approach, views it as more of a micromanagement sort of tactic. And she thinks that the guardrails for AI should be more specifically oriented towards what she calls a defined risk. And she also was skeptical about this EU strategy of having a more permission-based development for the AI frameworks that are utilized over in Europe there. So interesting dynamic going on, and we'll see how that manifests. I know that in California itself, I met a lot of people from the state of California, and they talked about how many bills with AI in the title are being thrown on Governor Gavin Newsom's desk there. So that's another kind of interesting development to watch from the opposite coast. But as far as things federally stand here, it remains to be seen.
Is there, with the election fast approaching on November 5th, AI, I think there's security and AI's potential to influence voters. Stefan, campaigns and election administration officials, are they taking steps to bolster cybersecurity efforts amidst the threats to global elections from, say, hostile foreign actors?
Yeah, and that was definitely something that surprised me during the DNC, was just how much emphasis was being placed on the cybersecurity element here. I attended a panel hosted by the University of Southern California, Annenberg School of Journalism, where there were a few different experts in that cyber policy realm. Somebody I spoke to, the analogy that one of these professors shared with me was that this disinformation or misinformation is like a hurricane, which a severe hurricane can be a rare event, but you have something like that spread and it can have a very corrosive effect and do a lot of damage. So from a social media aspect, there's a lot of concern about how different agencies like the FTC could potentially regulate those social media platforms. and then also to safeguard them from cyber attacks. Like we've seen even on the Republican side, the Trump campaign acknowledged that Iranian hackers had breached their campaign, and that there are always threats to high level campaigns like this. So it's definitely from the grassroots on up. Even your average volunteer now is being coached to be aware of whether they're using their Twitter account or whatever, to be aware of cyber threats, because these actors are looking for any way in to try to breach these campaign infrastructures.
Yeah, correct me if I'm wrong here. The FCC, they're looking to step up enforcement for AI scammers using deep fakes for candidates. And you recently wrote about disclosure requirements around the use of content generated by AI for political ads on broadcast, TV, and radio. But that doesn't necessarily apply to the web and social media. The FCC voted 3-2 along party lines to advance a proposal of rulemaking for AI's use in TV and radio. So are those disclosure requirements already in play, or is the commission still trying to get this in place?
Sure. So it's a really important question, because there was a pretty common misconception after the FCC voted on this topic that the move to require these disclosures was going to have an effect on the November election. And I want to be very clear that the proposed rule that was advanced will take probably at least a year for it to be finalized. And so therefore, it will have no bearing on this current election cycle. So I think that is an important thing to get out of the way. Having said that, it's still an important topic, one that we're going to continue to keep an eye on. And yes, the key point is that, as you know from your coverage of the traditional radio and TV broadcast space, it's certainly important to have disclosures. That argument has been advanced that it's important to know that this AI content, the FCC chair, Jessica Rosenworcel, has said that many times. The flip side of that is the potential for the really corrosive, the really potentially harmful AI-generated content that has no filter, has no mechanism to really fact check or to authenticate it. That's obviously what is spreading across social media platforms and the internet, and that's where the FCC has no power to regulate it. So that's that tension that we're talking about here, where it's something that they're essentially powerless to handle right now. But there's a lot of growing concern about that. It's targeted both sides. It's targeted former presidential candidates during the primary season, and it'll continue to be used. And so that's another thing that campaigns from the House and Senate on down to these local state House races, they're all trying to batten down the hatches and protect themselves from this.
So do you think that by the time we get to the midterm in 26, these things will be in place?
That's a good question. I think that definitely that year timeline or so would probably give enough lead time for this particular rule to come into play for that midterm cycle. Yeah.
Okay. Let's turn our attentions to kids' privacy laws. In late July, the Senate overwhelmingly approved, I think it was by a 91-3 count, a pair of bills, the Kids Online Safety Act, or KOSA, if you will, and the Children and Teens Online Privacy Protection Act, referred to as COPPA 2.0. They would force digital platforms to take, quote unquote, reasonable steps to prevent harms to children, such as bullying, drug addiction, and sexual exploitation, and would broaden existing federal privacy protections to include kids and teens 16 years old and younger. Stefan, you've written about this and are following it. Hasn't this been going on forever? What are advocates and critics saying about the Senate passage of KOSA and COPPA 2.0?
Yes. The interesting thing about this bill was that while it was overwhelmingly passed 91-3, the three holdouts were Republican Mike Lee of Utah, Republican Rand Paul of Kentucky, and then Democrat Ron Wyden of Oregon. What stood out from their criticisms was a free speech concern that, in Wyden's case in particular, he was concerned that LGBTQ plus advocacy groups and teens and minors who identify with that community would potentially be harmed because of the inability to express themselves, and that they could see their speech potentially suppressed under these new guidelines. There's argument that if you have these rules in place, they will force these platforms to err on the side of over-regulating content, even totally benign and objectively not harmful content that could be interpreted by someone as harmful. So that is the dissenting view there.
I gotcha. On the House side, there's a different bill. I think it's been stuck in the lower chamber for a while. Is something to come? Is there going to be a vote on that soon?
The Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, has said that he was supportive of the bill, but given the stakes of this election cycle, it's possible that something even as bipartisan as it was in the Senate with the composition of the House, it's unclear if they would manage a similar sort of bipartisan effort to pass their version of this. Now, there are some key differences on that House side of the bill, and the House essentially takes a much narrower tack in defining the scope of some of these issues. that the Senate bill covers. And we can get into some more of those specifics if you like.
Given what you're saying and the way government slowly churns, it wouldn't appear to me that there's going to be some consensus before year end. If there were, President Biden, has he said that he would sign these into law?
So yes, so that is another one of these interesting things to observe as we've seen this election cycle play out. And of course, having the change of the candidate now official on the Democratic side from President Joe Biden to Vice President Kamala Harris being the nominee now. Both Biden and Harris have publicly expressed support for the bill. Biden has said he would sign it. And interestingly enough, the senator from Ohio, J.D. Vance, who is the vice presidential nominee on the GOP side, has also expressed support for it. That is a kind of a rare issue in a campaign with a lot of division where you see a sweet spot in the middle of that Venn diagram there where they do overlap.
Okay. How about if in a broader sense, states have privacy laws to various degrees? Which states have maybe the strictest enforcement?
Yeah, California definitely comes to mind in terms of one of the stricter states there. And then something that we noted in the story was that much like kind of the broader attempts to regulate privacy and legislate it at the state level, the buzzword that you'll hear very often in when you talk to these experts is a patchwork. And so having that different approach across this 50-state federalist framework that our Constitution has set up, that has allowed for states like Arkansas, California, Louisiana, and Texas, which are some of the more prominent states which actually do have these children's privacy laws. They all have very inconsistent approaches. So if you're a business and you operate in just cherry pick from these 4 states, because those are some that have some more concrete laws on this. When you're talking about the age verification, parental consent for signing up for example, an Instagram account, the data collection limits of how much data these companies can actually keep and track on minors, the ad restrictions, and then even things from like, do parents have access to the account at all? And then once you've identified those things, what enforcement authority is there? Is it the FTC? Is it some other agency? Who's the one who's holding these companies accountable and then meting out some sort of punishment if applicable?
As you said, patchwork. I guess patchwork doesn't easily equate into a national law. That's not something that's on the horizon.
Yeah, definitely. I would be very surprised to see not necessarily an effort mounted to resurrect a federal privacy law that has happened in the last few years, although it hasn't gotten much traction. But definitely, even if one were to surface in this sort of lame duck / election cycle that we're seeing here, would be very surprised to see one actually pass through both chambers and get to President Biden's desk.
I got you. Stefan, we're getting to the end here, but I think we'd be remiss if we didn't talk a little about antitrust. Can you give us a sense for what was the center of the recent U.S. District Court of D.C. ruling against Google? And what does this portend for big tech?
Sure. Case in question here, which was the U.S. Versus Google, and was centered around the product that perhaps is most ubiquitous or is most synonymous with the company itself, which is, of course, its search platform, which is what the company was founded on and then has since, of course, expanded to many different products. But that search market itself, which Google has dominated since practically its existence, the argument advanced from the DOJ and then has also been echoed by the FTC, is that this monopoly that Google operated was connected to some distribution agreements that it had. If any iPhone user or Android user for that matter would know from opening their browser that Google has been the default, that Apple contract made up the largest amount of the share of contracts that it had, even with companies like AT&T, Verizon, or T-Mobile, which comprised the vast majority
of covering the entire world there almost.
Exactly right. There's even the handful of some of those smaller subsidiary carriers are likely owned by one of those big 3. So to your point, so those agreements were essentially the fundamental kind of issue in the view of the DOJ that was seen as an anti-competitive thing. Now, what was interesting to me was that in the course of reporting on this, I've seen there are new ways that, especially like this younger generation, Gen Z, and to extent some of the like younger millennials as well, are using different apps to search than one we conventionally think about. So redefining the search marketplace from just simply opening up your browser and going to Google or Bing or DuckDuckGo or whatever else may be out there. You would think about it in terms of going to TikTok or going to Instagram and searching for a recipe or a makeup routine or some sort of visual search component, which Google, of course, has had for a long time, but that newer medium has dramatically changed the way that some internet users are thinking about how the traditional search works now. And of course, there's something to be said for how the large language models and the AI chatbots have also altered this landscape. And
I was going to say that
yeah.
that AI is definitely reshaping the search business as well.
No question about it. It definitely is something that basically become omnipresent in that search market now. So you're seeing a lot of people change the way that they use the internet and go about their day to day because of these tools.
Finally here, what's the M&A outlook from a DC perspective? Do things remain the same with the Harris victory, or do they change with the administration if Donald Trump regains the Oval Office?
This is a fascinating question and one that we're going to continue to look into as we go forward here. I would say the interesting thing has been that if you look at what Kamala Harris and what JD Vance have said, it is not all that different when you look at the FTC chairwomanship of Lena Khan and the way that she's conducted things. They both have praised the way that she's had this more restraining approach to the bigger deals, and that philosophy may or may not continue in the event of a Trump victory, or it's possible that you would see friendlier tack taken towards big tech. But I do think that Harris and Biden, I don't see there being a huge difference. So in the event of a Harris victory, I would expect to see a similar approach. And if not Khan, I would expect to see somebody who has a very similar philosophy to her to share that at FTC.
All right. That concludes this episode of Media Talk. I just want to thank Stefan for spending a lot of time sharing his thoughts about some of the things that are going on in DC at the moment. Stefan, thanks very much.
Thanks, Mike. It's going to be a fun fall.
I also want to thank all of you for listening. This is Mike Reynolds. We'll catch up on the next edition of Media Talk.